Elijah's heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he stood frozen in the dimly lit alleyway, his breath shallow and unsteady. Shadows stretched across the cracked pavement, swallowing him whole as he watched the horrifying scene unfold before him. A burly man, his face obscured beneath the brim of a worn baseball cap, gripped a small girl's arm with an ironclad hold. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, her tiny frame trembling as she fought with every ounce of strength she had. Tears streaked her dirt-smudged cheeks as she struggled, her desperate cries muffled against the looming presence of the man dragging her toward a rusted, beat-up van parked just a few feet away. Elijah's pulse quickened, his entire body screaming for him to move, to do something, anything. He had no idea who this little girl was, but the raw terror in her wide, tear-filled eyes struck something deep within him. He couldn't just stand there. He wouldn't. His feet finally obeyed his racing thoughts, and without a second's hesitation, he surged forward. He had no plan, no weapon, nothing but an unshakable determination to stop this nightmare from unfolding. His breath came in ragged gasps as he moved swiftly, ducking behind a nearby dumpster to stay out of sight. The man hadn't noticed him yet, but time was slipping away. Elijah clenched his fists, waiting, calculating. His heart slammed against his ribcage as he saw the man fumble with the van's sliding door, momentarily distracted. This was his chance. "Hey!" Elijah's voice rang out, sharp and laced with fury. The kidnapper's head snapped up in surprise, his grip loosening just enough for Sophie to jerk back slightly. Elijah didn't waste a second. His eyes darted to the ground where a loose brick sat among the debris. Without thinking, he snatched it up and hurled it with every ounce of strength in his body. The brick collided with the man's shoulder, a sickening thud echoing in the alley. The man let out a grunt of pain, stumbling backward. "Run!" Elijah yelled, his voice desperate. For a moment, Sophie stood paralyzed, fear locking her limbs in place, but then something in her snapped, and she took off, sprinting as fast as her little legs could carry her. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't look back. The man, now furious, turned his rage toward Elijah. His eyes burned with menace as he lunged forward, his heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. But adrenaline coursed through Elijah's veins like fire, igniting a strength he didn't know he had. As the kidnapper swung at him, Elijah dodged just in time, then retaliated with a punch straight to the man's chest. The impact sent the man staggering, just enough for Elijah to make his move. Wasting no time, he spun on his heel and bolted, catching up to Sophie and grasping her trembling hand. "Come on!" he urged, his voice raw with urgency. They ran, faster than either of them ever had before, weaving through the streets until they reached the bright lights of a small corner store. Sophie gasped for air between sobs, her body trembling violently. The store owner, an elderly woman with a kind but sharp gaze, took one look at them and immediately reached for the phone. Elijah stood at the entrance, his body shaking, sweat dripping down his temple as he watched the alley in the distance. The man stood there for a moment, realizing he had lost, before vanishing into the shadows. But Elijah didn't let himself relax. Not yet. He tightened his grip on Sophie's hand, standing guard until the flashing blue lights of the police arrived. When Sophie's parents finally came, their faces contorted with a mixture of grief and overwhelming relief. Her father fell to his knees, pulling his daughter into his arms as tears spilled freely down his face. He looked up at Elijah, voice shaking. "Thank you. You saved my little girl. I don't know how to repay you." Elijah swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. He shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just did what was right." But as the police took his statement and Sophie clung to her mother, Elijah knew deep down that this wasn't over. His gut told him this man wouldn't stop so easily. And he was right. As he stood there, still catching his breath, he saw the van again, this time creeping toward the outskirts of town, toward a place where no one would hear the screams, the abandoned warehouse. Elijah knew what he had to do. Elijah's heart pounded like a hammer inside his chest, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as he carried Sophie through the doorway and into the cold embrace of the night. The city stretched out before them, dark and silent, the empty streets echoing their hurried footsteps. Fear clawed at his ribs, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The heavy thuds of boots behind him told him the kidnapper was close, too close. Sophie clung to his side, her tiny fingers gripping his torn sleeve with all the strength her trembling body could muster. She was terrified, but she trusted him, trusted that he would get her to safety. "Help!" Elijah's voice was hoarse, desperate as he shouted into the night, hoping, praying, that someone would hear. He turned a corner sharply, nearly colliding with a group of people standing outside a small convenience store, its dim neon sign flickering against the darkness. Elijah's wild, panic-stricken eyes met those of the shopkeeper, a man who looked up just in time to see the danger chasing them. "Call the cops!" the shopkeeper shouted, his voice cutting through the night like a blade. The people around them snapped into action, their faces shifting from confusion to understanding in an instant. Some rushed inside to make the call, while others instinctively stepped forward, forming a barrier between Elijah, Sophie, and the approaching danger. The kidnapper skidded to a halt, his eyes darting between the gathering crowd and the girl he had so nearly stolen away. He hesitated, his confidence cracking. The shouting, the watchful eyes, the risk, it was too much. Without a word, he turned on his heel and bolted into the darkness, disappearing into the night. Elijah's body sagged with relief. His knees nearly buckled beneath him as he clutched Sophie close, feeling the tremors racking her tiny frame. She buried her face against his chest, exhausted, afraid, but safe. Finally, safe. The shopkeeper stepped forward, his expression kind as he handed them bottles of water, his voice gentle as he reassured them. "You're all right now, son. She's safe. You did good." Moments later, the wail of sirens shattered the stillness of the street. Red and blue lights painted the world in flashes of urgency, and soon officers were surrounding them, securing the scene, asking questions. For the first time that night, Elijah allowed himself to breathe. His body ached, his muscles screamed from exhaustion, but none of it mattered. He had saved her. He had stopped the unthinkable. As the police worked, Elijah stayed by Sophie's side, never letting go of her hand. He had done more than rescue a life tonight. He had changed one. And somehow, in ways he didn't fully understand yet, his own life had changed too. A frantic cry split through the air. "Mom! Dad!" Sophie's voice was raw with emotion as she tore herself from the officer's gentle grasp and sprinted toward the two figures racing toward her, her mother and father. Their faces streaked with worry and exhaustion, fell to their knees as their daughter launched into their arms. Relief crashed over them in waves, their sobs breaking through the tense atmosphere. "Sophie, oh my God, my baby," her mother whispered, pressing frantic kisses into her daughter's hair. "We thought we lost you." Her father held her tightly, his entire body shaking. "We were so scared," he admitted, his voice unsteady. Sophie, still wrapped in their embrace, turned her tear-streaked face toward Elijah and pointed. "This is Elijah," she said softly. "He saved me." The Millers turned toward him. For a moment they just stared. Elijah stood awkwardly near the officers, his clothes torn, his face streaked with sweat and dirt, looking like he didn't belong among them. He was just a boy, ragged, out of place, yet undeniably brave. And in that moment, the stark contrast between their worlds didn't matter. Mr. Miller took a hesitant step forward, his throat tightening. Then, with quiet reverence, he extended his hand. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved our daughter's life. I don't even know how to begin to thank you." Elijah hesitated before shaking his hand. The grip was firm, filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. "I just did what I had to do," Elijah said simply, his voice quiet. Mrs. Miller knelt in front of him, tears still glistening in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "You did something extraordinary." Elijah shifted uncomfortably, unused to this kind of praise. But when he looked at Sophie, the way she clung to her parents, safe and whole, he felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. pride. As the night wore on, flashing cameras replaced the flashing sirens. News reporters had arrived, swarming the Millers, asking frantic questions. "How did you find her?" one reporter asked. "We had been searching everywhere, calling the police, losing hope," Mr. Miller answered, still shaken. "And then we got the news that she was safe, that this boy, Elijah, had risked his own life to save her." Elijah stood on the outskirts of the chaos, overwhelmed. He had spent so much of his life being invisible, yet now the entire city seemed to be looking at him, and the world was listening. His story spread like wildfire, across the city, across the internet. Messages of gratitude and admiration poured in. Strangers hailed him as a hero, while local organizations reached out with offers of help, scholarships, and opportunities he never could have imagined. The Millers, moved beyond words, refused to let this be the end of Elijah's story. They reached out to his mother, learning about the hardships he had faced, about the struggles he had endured. They vowed to help, to make sure the boy who had saved their daughter would never feel alone again. For the first time in his life, Elijah felt like more than just another face in the crowd. He had saved a life, and in doing so, he had changed his own. The following evening, Elijah and his mother found themselves standing before the grand entrance of the Miller family's mansion. The towering estate was unlike anything Elijah had ever seen. Marble pillars, sparkling chandeliers, a dining table long enough to seat an army. It was a world so far removed from his own that he felt like he was stepping into a dream. His hands trembled slightly as he entered, his mother beside him, equally overwhelmed. But then, a familiar voice broke through his unease. "Elijah!" Sophie ran up to him, her bright smile cutting through his nerves. She grabbed his hand and pulled him inside, introducing him to her parents in a way that made everything feel just a little less intimidating. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt something warm settle in his chest. Belonging. His journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. As Elijah and his mother sat down at the beautifully set dining table, an air of warmth and sincerity surrounded them. The Millers made an earnest effort to put them at ease, not by grand gestures, but through genuine conversation, asking about their lives, listening intently, and treating them as equals, not as people they were merely extending a favor to. The evening unfolded with shared laughter, heartfelt stories, and moments of quiet understanding. They spoke about everything, their favorite foods, childhood memories, and the dreams they once thought were beyond reach. Yet beneath the surface of that comfortable atmosphere, there was an undeniable sense that something life-changing was about to unfold. As the plates were cleared, Mr. Miller stood, his eyes locking onto Elijah's mother with a look of deep sincerity. The room quieted, anticipation thick in the air. "We've been thinking a lot about what happened," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "What Elijah did for Sophie, what he did for our family. It's something we will never forget. And we don't believe it should end here. We believe he deserves more. He deserves the opportunity to chase his dreams and build the future he deserves." Elijah and his mother exchanged uncertain glances, their hands tightening around each other. They weren't sure what he meant, but they could feel the weight of his words. Mr. Miller continued, his expression resolute. "We've decided to make sure he has that chance. Elijah, we want to pay for your education at one of the best private schools in the country. You will have the finest teachers, the best resources, and every opportunity to follow your passions." Tears welled in Elijah's eyes. He had never dared to imagine something like this. It felt surreal, like a dream slipping through his fingers before he could grasp it. But then Mrs. Miller leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "That's not all," she said, placing a comforting hand over Elijah's mother's. "You too deserve stability, dignity, and security. We want to offer you a position at our company, one that pays well, one that ensures you and Elijah never have to struggle like before. We want to make sure your family is taken care of, just as Elijah took care of ours." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. It was too much, too generous. His life had been built on survival, on scraping by with whatever they had. This world of wealth and privilege, It wasn't his. He wasn't sure he could ever belong in it. His mother's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I don't know if we belong in your world," she admitted, her fingers tightening in her lap. "We've never lived like this before. We don't know how." Mr. Miller's face softened, his understanding clear. "I get it," he said gently. "It's a big change, and it's okay to be unsure. But I want you to know something. Sophie and I came from nothing. We worked our way up just like you have. We understand struggle. We understand the weight of fighting for a better life, and we want to offer that same chance to you, to your family. It's not about fitting into our world. It's about giving you the opportunity to create the life you deserve." Mrs. Miller turned to Elijah, her voice full of conviction. "We're not doing this out of charity, Elijah. We're doing it because you deserve it. You saved my daughter. And that tells us everything we need to know about the kind of person you are. You have greatness in you, and we want to give you every chance to reach it." Elijah's chest felt tight, his emotions a storm inside him. He looked at his mother, searching her face for guidance. Her lips quivered as she fought back tears, her gaze full of something he had rarely seen, hope. "For you, Elijah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I will do anything. You deserve this. And I won't hold us back from the future you can have." A lump formed in Elijah's throat as he swallowed hard. He had spent his whole life believing he had to fight alone, that no one would ever offer him a way out. But here they were, offering him a future he had never dared to imagine, and his mother, his rock, his protector, was telling him to take it. He took a deep breath, his voice unsteady but firm. "Okay," he whispered, then stronger. "Okay, I'll do it. For us. For you, Mom." A wave of relief and joy washed over the Millers as they exchanged knowing glances. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning full of promise. That night, as Elijah and his mother walked away from the Millers' home, they carried with them something they hadn't felt in years: hope. The future that had always seemed unreachable was now within their grasp. Elijah embraced his new life with a determination he hadn't known he possessed. At his new school, he poured himself into his studies, excelling in ways that surprised even him. But more than that, he became a source of inspiration for those around him. His story, his resilience, his unwavering determination to rise above his circumstances, it resonated with his classmates, earning him their admiration and respect. His mother, too, flourished in her new role. With a stable job and a steady income, she finally had the means to provide the kind of life she had always dreamed of for her son. Their new home was warm, safe, and full of promise, a stark contrast to the hardships they had once endured. And through it all, his bond with Sophie deepened. What had started as an act of courage had blossomed into a profound friendship. They spent their days together, learning, growing, and reminding each other of the power of kindness and second chances. Months later, Elijah found himself standing on the stage of his school's assembly hall, looking out at a sea of faces: students, teachers, mentors. The same school that had once felt like a world he didn't belong in now felt like home. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "It means you care enough to do what's right, even when it's hard." The room fell silent, hanging onto every word. And then a thunderous applause erupted, filling the hall with an energy that vibrated deep in his chest. He spotted Sophie in the crowd, her face beaming with pride. And in that moment, he knew. His journey had not just changed his own life, it had rippled outward, touching the lives of others in ways he never imagined. As the applause settled, he looked out at the crowd, a quiet gratitude filling his heart. He no longer saw himself as just a boy from a rough neighborhood. He was someone with a future full of promise, with people who believed in him, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe it too. Sophie rose to her feet, clapping for her best friend, knowing that together they had overcome so much. The power of kindness and courage had reshaped their futures. And as they stood there, The world felt just a little bit brighter because of it.